Welcome and thank you, everyone. I'm happy today to welcome you to today's webinar presenting the Philippine Downstream Natural Gas Industry Investor's Guide. My name is Amanda Bandindul, and I am the Energy and Infrastructure Team Lead for the USAID Regional Development Mission for Asia, based here in Bangkok, Thailand. And I would like to take a moment today to thank the Philippines Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Commerce Commercial Law Development Program, the U.S. Department of State Bureau of Energy Resources, the Gas Policy Development Project of the Philippines, and the U.S. Energy Association, USEA, for your collaboration in organizing today's webinar through Asia Edge. Asia Edge, or the Enhancing Development Growth Through Energy, is a whole-of-government initiative launched in July 2018 by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Asia Edge builds on decades of robust U.S. government policy and programmatic work in the region and recognizes that enhanced coordination among the U.S. government agencies will accelerate our engagement and benefit the region and the United States. Asia Edge has 4 key objectives, including strengthening the energy security of allies and partners, creating open and efficient rules-based and transparent energy markets, improving free, fair, and reciprocal energy trading relations, and expanding access to affordable, reliable energy. USAID, along with the other implementing agencies, each carry their own comparative advantage to realizing the goals of Asia Edge. In this vein, USAID's strategic approach focuses on utility modernization, deployment of advanced energy systems, transparent best value procurement, and regional energy market integration, with the overall goal to advance Asia's self-reliance and security through the expansion of energy markets. All of these pillars will build upon USAID's comparative advantage of building capacity of partners and promoting global best practices. Today's session, which is hosted by the USAID-supported U.S.-Asia Gas Partnership, or AGP, supports partner countries throughout the region by mobilizing private investment and modernizing energy sector technologies that expand domestic gas markets across Asia. These investments will support the region's future economic growth, self-reliance, and resilience for a sustainable energy future. The partnership is designed to both highlight technical topics for regulators, utilities, and policymakers across the region, and to foster business development and networking. Best practice documents, technical standards, safety guidelines, and environmental regulations are shared with partners in emerging LNG importing countries across the Indo-Pacific. The AGP is modeled after a successful gas working group that the USEA and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, established in partnership with USAID in the Europe and Eurasia region several years ago. The objective of AGP is to build capacity and share lessons learned in the development of secure, reliable, and economic sources of natural gas. South and Southeast Asia will be the biggest LNG demand growth market into 2040 as demand from traditional importers in North Asia and Europe decline. Practical training and strategic advice targeted at ministries and regulators aims to drive more informed policy and decision-making to increase investment. With a long-term vision to enable the creation of a regional gas market, the AGP will facilitate a shared understanding between government officials and the private sector about the technical, commercial, and economic factors that spur investment. In June 2019, NARUC and USAID conducted an official kickoff for the newly established bilateral regulatory partnership with the Energy Regulatory Commission, or ERC, of the Philippines in Manila. The partnership focused on downstream natural gas regulation and methods for expediting regulatory review of current and legacy power sales agreements, or PSA applications, which the ERC has been backlogged with for nearly 2 decades. Expert volunteers from the U.S. provided key methods by which the ERC can consolidate PSA applications and review their contents more efficiently to expedite the PSA application review process, clearing the backlog of hundreds of PSAs pending regulatory reviews. The participants of the partnership exchange identified a list of short to medium-term actionable items that can be implemented to address the backlog. An expedited PSA review process will help ensure that distribution companies are able to purchase the power they need in a timely manner. During this session, we look forward to sharing updates on the Philippines gas industry and to provide context on the development of the Downstream Natural Gas Industry Investor's Guide. We hope it can serve as a model to assist the economic development of partners across the region. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to the dialogue. Next, I would like to give the floor to my colleague from the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Energy Resources, Evan McLaughlin, to share some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And I assume someone will tell me if they can't hear me, but I think all is working okay. Thanks for everyone who logged in from around the globe for this discussion. This is by far the largest group of people I've ever talked to over the internet, so it's pretty fun and exciting for me. I'd also like to thank the Philippines Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Gas Policy Development Project, of which I'm a big fan, Dr. Clare especially, and also the USEA for organizing this event. And thanks especially to USAID for inviting me to join this discussion, highlighting the Philippines' role in the world LNG market. Let me start by repeating a couple of statistics that I've heard from my Assistant Secretary, Frank Fannin, and other principals at the State Department recently. First, the Indo-Pacific region represents 2/3 of global energy demand growth through 2040. Much of this demand comes from a vibrant, young population that demands affordable, reliable energy. The IEA estimates that the Indo-Pacific needs more than $1 trillion of investment annually to meet that projected demand. And we've seen that the disruptions of the COVID pandemic only remind us of the urgent need to build diverse and resilient energy supply chains. As Amanda noted, each agency involved in advancing our Asia Edge goals brings a different capability in our bilateral and regional work. The U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources, where I manage a foreign assistance program focused on energy, partners with countries and institutions to achieve their energy security and development goals by promoting the right conditions to attract sound investment. The Bureau engages through diplomacy, of course, for the State Department, for example, through ongoing government-to-government energy security dialogues. We also work closely with governments on a range of technical assistance programs dedicated to supporting competitive and transparent energy markets by strengthening energy sector governance. So back in 2018, the Bureau of Energy Resources began a partnership for the U.S. Department of State to fund the Gas Policy Development Project. This was implemented by our colleagues at the University of the Philippines. Through this project, we've had the great opportunity to support the Philippines Department of Energy in developing gas and LNG sector legal and regulatory frameworks and best practice. My Assistant Secretary has recognized that the Philippines is creating a level playing field for all competitors in its approach to LNG development, and we've greatly appreciated the collaboration. The GPDP team effectively leveraged university and outside experts to augment the DOE's existing expertise on gas and LNG issues. And one of the major outputs of this cooperation, the Investor's Guide, helps ensure a rules-based process for accessing the Philippines LNG market. Frankly, we consider the Investor's Guide to be one of the capstones of phase 1 of GPDP. We're also encouraged that the Philippines Department of Energy has prioritized this cooperation and look forward to continued cooperation between DOE and the university through GPDP 2, which will be coming soon. So from our perspective at the Energy Bureau, at the State Department, it comes back to the importance of having transparent, fair, above ground business and investment conditions. The more we can encourage free enterprise, rule of law, transparency, transactions, the more successful and secure the Philippines, the region, and the world will be. Thanks so much again. I very much look forward to hearing from Assistant Secretary Polito and Dr. Clarete and Mohammed and everyone else who's on the call. So with that, I will turn it back over to our moderators and turn to Assistant Secretary Polito for an overview of the Philippine downstream natural gas industry.
So it's, well, depending on where you are, which part of the world you're coming from, it's either good morning or good evening, which is one of the interesting things about webinars like these. So we'd like to start with saying hi, essentially, to the people who we've worked with over the past few years, our friends and colleagues from the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of Commerce, our friends from the USAID, Dr. Ramon Clarete from the UP School of Economics, Prof. Mohammed Abisi, Amanda Vandendoel, Evan McLaughlin, John Edgar. Well, good morning or good evening. I'd like to share my screen, if I may, in order to provide an overview of the Philippine downstream natural gas industry. So I'll give a quick overview of the Philippine downstream natural gas industry, share a few of our development programs, our efforts in promoting and trying to develop our very nascent natural gas industry, give a few points regarding the regulatory framework, of which the USAID and our colleagues from the US have been very actively helping us to develop it further. And then to share a few ideas about how we're trying to move forward. So the Philippine natural gas industry is essentially all about Malampaya. The industry began when Malampaya's the gas to power project started sometime in October 2016. And the Malampaya project is run by a consortium composed of Shell, Chevron, and a subsidiary of the Philippine National Oil Company, the Exploration Corporation, or PNOCEC. To date, our indigenous gas from the Malampaya gas field, which is located in northern Palawan, supplies gas through a 504-kilometer pipeline that goes from Palawan all the way to Batangas. Batangas is a province of the Philippines, down south of Manila, about 100 kilometers away from Manila. And it provides gas essentially to 6 entities, 5 of which are power plants owned by 2 companies, and a refinery owned by Shell. Of these power plants, 3 of them, Ilijan, Santa Rita, and San Lorenzo, with about a total capacity of about 2,700 megawatts, provide baseload generation to Luzon. The San Gabriel power plant provides mid-night generation, while the Avion power plant provides for a peaking demand in the Luzon grid. Apart from these power plants, the Malampaya gas is also used as fuel by a refinery of Shell. Unfortunately, because of the COVID pandemic and I guess the dynamics in the international oil market, Shell just recently informed the Department of Energy of the Philippines that they will be shutting down their refinery and converting it into an import petroleum terminal. In which case, the gas offtake that Shell uses accounts for about 2% of the gas that's taken from Malampaya. So there will be space there. So most of the natural gas in the Philippines is really for power generation. It's about 3,200 megawatts, which comprises about roughly 29% of the whole country's power generation capacity. But it provides about 23% of the Luzon grid. No, I think I got that mixed up. 21% for all over the country, 29% for the Luzon grid. And this is critical to note because Luzon is essentially the business and the manufacturing hub of the country. And 29% is huge portion of our power generation. So though all the gas that's taken from Malampaya, the sole indigenous resource of natural gas in the country, and which accounts for 3,200 megawatts of our power generation in the country, is covered by about 6 gas sales purchase agreements. It's interesting to note, and it's critical to note, that these 6 gas GSPAs will all end between 2022 to 2024. The first of which is the Ilihan Power Plant, which will end in 2022. All of these GSPAs are part of the reason why, well, we'll explain further, why the country has to look for imported natural gas, because even though the supply has been projected to go as far as 2027, so our projections would show that the potential drop off or depletion of supply might begin as early as 2022. And because we only have this single sole source of natural gas, it's difficult, if not impossible, for other sectors to come in and use natural gas. Other power plant generators, other companies can't project and plan or construct other infrastructure that uses natural gas because we are dependent on the sole indigenous resource. And currently there is no indigenous replacement. We've been pushing for our programs for upstream energy exploration, and that would take time. And currently there is no clear potential replacement or, well, indigenous resource replacement for Malampaya, but that's a continuing activity, that's a continuing effort. And that's the reason why this time frame, this period of these GSPAs of ending between 2022 and 2024, and the dynamic of the potential drop off in supply. These are factors that come into play regarding the regulatory framework and our thrust to create infrastructure for the importation of liquefied natural gas. So before we can even, well, we really want to increase the use of natural gas in the country, but we can't, of course, before you can try to develop an industry, you need to ensure supply. So the supply effort, to ensure the adequacy of supply, the 2 efforts are our upstream energy exploration program, which is called the Philippine Philippine Conventional Energy Contracting Program, or the PCECP. So we've been trying to promote the Philippines as an upstream energy exploration investment area abroad. And well, fortunately enough, we've gotten really good interest. But first, considering the time frame involved in exploration and actually coming up and developing a well, that's going to take a while. The second effort is what we believe to be more critical, which is to get the private sector to come in and invest in a regasification facility. So we've been doing market development, of course, partnering with the private sector in order to encourage the investment to the critical infrastructure in putting up a regasification facility with the help of our partner agencies abroad. For example, the USAID, the US Department of State, and the US Department of Commerce. We've been doing capacity building with not only within the Department of Energy, but also with the private sector, with the other government agencies involved, because of course, critical infrastructure like this would require a lot of work from our other partner agencies, and of course, capacity building for all the other stakeholders as well, including our colleagues in the legislative, in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So as I was explaining earlier, the primary effort in order to ensure supply of natural gas centers around our exploration program. But of course, it's really unpredictable. It's not assured. So this is a continuous effort. But of course, we can't solely depend on this. So the idea really, the critical thing for us, considering that there might be, well, a projected drop in supply by 2022. And as I said earlier, 29% of the power generation for Luzon is provided by those power plants running on natural gas in Batangas. The option really is to ensure LNG importation. And we believe that the Philippines is strategically placed to tap that market, considering that it's essentially in the center of the Asian and Southeast Asian liquefied natural gas trade. So logistically speaking, it's not difficult to tap the market, but we do need to start with the necessary regasification infrastructure. So as discussed briefly earlier, we do not have an indigenous replacement for Malampaya. And to continue the development and use of natural gas in the Philippines, we do need LNG importation. And really, considering that the global supply is adequate, it would be a good idea as well, because it essentially provides us with, it diversifies our energy resources. It gives the country more energy security. And we do prefer right now, there is a continuing effort within the Department of Energy to promote the further use of liquefied natural gas, considering its nature. We are a firm believer that it is well, like I always say, it's not just a bridge towards renewables for the future. It's already serving as a bridge for renewables, and we want to increase that participation of liquefied natural gas, not only in power generation, which is the anchor market currently in the Philippines, but we are continuously promoting that it be used for other industries as well. And considering how small the use of LNG is in the market, and considering further that recent analysis of our Power Bureau within the department, the Philippine Department of Energy, that it might be preferred in order to improve the grid's stability. We have a current study from our Power Bureau wherein they believe that the Philippines needs more flexible power generation, more mid-merit power generation as opposed to baseload. So there is a recommendation, an initial study by our Power Bureau to increase the use of mid-merit flexible generation in our grid. So just in our power sector, considering that push, that future push by the Department of Energy, there is a very big business opportunity to come into the Philippines, and plus the potential for natural gas to be used in other sectors, such as in agriculture, in manufacturing, and in transportation. There was actually an initial effort in the Philippines to use natural gas in public transportation, and that exactly succeed because of some technical issues and some logistical issues, but the potential is there. So we believe it's a very big business opportunity to come in and use natural gas, promote and sell natural gas in the Philippines. So the infrastructure development, the critical infrastructure development is ongoing. Of course, it starts with the sourcing of liquefied natural gas, and that would require a liquefied natural gas terminal. And there are ongoing efforts by the private sector. It's a private sector-led initiative, and most of them are so far on track. One consortium has already signified to the Philippine Department of Energy that they've reached a final investment decision, although they did change their plan from an onshore facility to an interim FSRU facility. Besides that, we're assisting the private sector regarding the transmission pipeline for the regasification facility. And of course, we've been discussing with the potential off-takers as well. So there are several, but these four we wanted to share with you. The four consortiums or four groups who have proposed terminal projects in Luzon. And these are a consortium of the First Gen LNG Corporation with a Japanese company, Tokyo Gas, Accelerate Energy of the US, who partnered with a Philippine company called Topline, if I'm not mistaken, and then Batangas Clean Energy, which has a US partner as well, and then Energy World Gas Operations. Currently, as far as our records are currently showing, First Gen is on track. They changed their proposal from an onshore facility to an interim FSRU. And they did estimate that they will be ready or online by the fourth quarter of 2022. Accelerate Energy so far is online, is on track rather. And they claim that they will be ready by the third quarter of 2021. And the two other proposals are so far on track, and we're all hoping that all of these projects would be able to finish on time, considering again the potential drop-off of supply or critical depletion of the Malampaya resource by as early as 2022 to 2024. So just to give a quick idea about the regulatory framework that serves as a guidepost for potential investors and for our stakeholders in the Philippines natural gas industry. Focusing on the downstream natural gas, we have, well, there's currently no law that specifically tackles natural gas in the country. But considering that the Philippine Department of Energy does have this broad mandate regarding energy, we issued back in 2017 the Philippine Downstream Natural Gas Regulation, which provides the current framework for the downstream natural gas industry in the Philippines. It provides the policies, the rules, and the standards for essentially the siting, the construction of the infrastructure. It provides the compliance for importation of LNG, supply and transport of natural gas, and all of the legal, technical, and financial documentary requirements. The reason why I say this is the current regulation for natural gas is because we have an ongoing effort with the Philippine Senate and the Philippine House of Representatives to pass and institutionalize most of the ideas contained herein, contained in the Philippine Downstream Natural Gas Regulation, and hopefully pass it and make it a law. We're pushing and targeting and hoping that it would be passed this year, if not, maybe hopefully early next year. We're currently pushing for the Philippine Downstream Natural Gas Law. Sorry. We also have some quality standards that we issued for the quality specification for natural gas. And of course, one of the more or less helpful regulations for investors in the Philippines, for the stakeholders, is an executive order signed by the President back in 2017 called Executive Order Number 30, which provides for the EPNS, which is essentially a certificate that it's a certificate that provides that the project is one of national significance. Sad to say, the reason why we helped with the issuance of this executive order is because based on the World Bank study, the time required in order to finish energy projects in the Philippines is quite significant. There was just so much regulatory capture there. So we pushed for the issuance of this executive order in order to essentially cut that process and streamline it, make it more transparent, make it faster. So that's been very helpful. So far, our stakeholders have told us that being given one of these certificates has helped them greatly because it provides for certain interesting processes that shortens everything. And then, of course, we have the Ease of Doing Business Act in the Philippines, which also has been helpful to our investors and stakeholders. Way forward, I'd really like to take this opportunity. I cannot say this enough. Dr. Ramon Clarete and Mohammed Badisi and the people around with them in their respective institutions has been very, very helpful in helping the national government refine our policies. They have given us a lot of insights. The Gas Policy Development Project has been really, really, really helpful. Considering that the Philippines has such a nascent industry and we've never imported liquefied natural gas, having partners such as our colleagues from their respective institutions has been very, very helpful. And again, thank you very much to our colleagues in USAID for inviting us. And if there are any questions, you can reach us at these details. Thank you once again, and good morning or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're coming from.
I think it's my turn now. And can you hear me? Okay, I have unmuted myself. And the one controlling my presentation is the U.S. Energy Association. And therefore, I would be saying, next slide, please, as I go along my presentation. Okay, let me just get myself organized here first. All right, okay. So again, I echo Assistant Secretary Pulido in greeting you. Good morning or good evening, wherever you may be. First of all, I would also like to thank the organizers of this webinar for inviting me to give a talk at this 5th webinar in the webinar series organized by the U.S. Energy Association and the USAID, U.S. Asia Gas Partnership. So I'll be talking to you this morning about the LNG Investors Guide in the Philippines. This guide was developed by the Oil Industry Management Bureau of the Philippines, DOE, and the Gas Policy Development Project, or GPDP. I was heading that project until March 2020. And we developed this guide primarily to provide potential investors in LNG facilities here in the Philippines an adequate working knowledge to come to an informed investment decisions, as well as to facilitate investments. Next slide, please. Okay, on this slide, you can see the table of contents of the guide. There are 4 sections of it, but I will only talk about 2 sections of them. The outlook and the potential investments, and the second one would be the primer for application. Next slide, please. So I'll just be quick here because Assistant Secretary Pulido had earlier mentioned already about us tapping the indigenous natural gas from Malampaya, and this particular supply is going to dry up sometime in the middle of this decade. And there is no indigenous gas replacement of it, so we would be importing LNG just to avoid disruption of energy supply or power supply in the Philippines. And by the way, we had this before in the 1990s when we decided to mothball the nuclear power plant. The country was not prepared for a replacement of it, and so we had these crippling power shortages in the early 1990s. And I think the Department of Energy is very clear. It doesn't want the country to go through that again. So there's preparations right now to have a smooth transition from natural gas to LNG. Next slide, please. Now, most of the natural gas in the world today, of course, is used to generate electricity. There are other uses, and but in the case of the Philippines, next slide, please. 95% of the indigenous gas from Malampaya since 2001 has basically been used for fuel. So natural gas equals power, and there was no way the other non-power LNG businesses having a chance to develop because we didn't have any supply of additional indigenous gas for them. Next slide, please. Okay, so the planned importation of LNG is primarily intended to replace the indigenous gas supply coming from Malampaya. Something like around we are needing about 3.2 gas to generate 3.2 gigawatts. That's the current use of gas in the existing gas power plants in Batangas. But smooth transition from indigenous gas to LNG is not just the objective here. The Philippines DOE has projected additional power demand to meet the long-term development objective of the Philippine government, which is getting rid of income poverty by 2040. And for that, the country would need around 44 gigawatts over the next quarter of a century. So power would clearly remain to be the major use of LNG in the Philippines. From the middle of this decade, when Malampaya runs out of natural gas onwards. So as Assistant Secretary Polide mentioned, 3 companies now who are holders of a notice to proceed permits are now preparing themselves or busy in gathering all the requirements to be able to get a permit to construct their facilities, which are these LNG terminals. So the question now is, for this additional 44 gigawatts that we project to be needed by the Philippines to sustain high growth and attain the objective of becoming an upper middle income country by 2040. Will that give the LNG or gas a higher share of the energy mix? Well, that remains to be seen because the DOE is very clear about its policy. It does not prescribe any mix of fuel between coal, LNG, and the renewable energy REs. The realized mix would have to be decided upon in the marketplace. But I think it would not be really so a big surprise if this access to the world's LNG supply would not give a chance of new gas-fired power plants to be constructed. Basically, if we have only around 4 or 5 LNG gas-fired plants here in the Philippines, that's because the supply of natural gas is just limited. So by tapping into the world supply of LNG, that opens up to the higher likelihood that the LNG share in the fuel mix could increase. Next slide, please. Okay. So my second point about this first part of the guide is this: the drying up of Malampaya is an opportunity for us. It triggers the start of non-power LNG businesses in the country. So the big companies like First Gen, Accelerate, and Batangas Clean Energy, all of which are now busy preparing to construct their respective LNG storage tanks, eventually would pave the way for them to be selling to third-party users, whether they are for power or non-power. And so clearly, I think this particular expected problem about our lack of indigenous gas, this tapping of LNG from the rest of the world, could be a boon to the non-power uses or businesses of those who are using LNG. Next slide, please. Okay, before you is some kind of a functional LNG value chain. This slide attempts to show a functional LNG value chain, starting with the liquefaction plants in exporting countries. LNG is brought into the country by overseas LNG ships to supply LNG to receiving onshore or offshore LNG terminals or LNG distributor aggregator companies. Onshore and offshore terminal companies may supply most of its LNG supply for their respective gas-fired power plants, like, for example, First Gen, which has 4 gas-fired power plants in Batangas. But with expanded terminal capacity of these companies or by new companies who may enter the industry, they may be able to supply LNG to independent gas-fired power plants or to LNG trucking companies or LNG domestic shipping companies. These companies may operate inter-island shipping services or trucking services which would run on natural gas, or operate LNG carrying ships or trucks for other uses like small receiving terminals for small gas power plants in off-grid islands and remote areas. In the long run, these other businesses may sprout like LNG land transportation, fuel stations or bunkering stations, or city gas networks for residential uses of LNG. Next slide, please. So all of that could happen only if there would be a steady supply of LNG into the country. And so it's in other words, the drying up of Malampaya is basically opens up our country to developing new non-power businesses, such as those in the slides right now. Next slide, please. But how open are these existing companies open to switching from diesel to natural gas? So GPDP conducted a survey of exporting firms located in an economic zone in Laguna and Batangas provinces, asking them if they were willing to switch to natural gas from diesel. Diesel is widely used by these companies in production and for their own power requirement. See, nearly 3/4 of them are open to switching to natural gas from diesel. They agree that natural gas is safe, 57% of them, and a larger shares, 3/4 of them, think natural gas is even cost competitive compared to diesel. Next slide, please. The reasons for switching vary. A great majority of the survey respondent firms regard compatibility and safety as their top consideration for switching. Environmental concerns and retrofitting costs of equipment turn out not to be important factors for their decision to switch to natural gas. And the majority of them, like 70%, would require natural gas from about 1 to 20 million standard cubic feet per day if they switch to natural gas. So there's a growing market, industrial use of natural gas in these economic zones. Now, the PwC has identified in its report, citing Engine Strategy and Research, that the most promising small-scale LNG businesses are the LNG power systems, marine LNG, and LNG trucks. By 2030, they say the total demand for LNG in terms of million tons of LNG per year is projected to reach nearly 90 million tons. LNG trucking has the fastest growth in demand, followed by LNG shipping and LNG power. And so, of course, relative prices would between oil and LNG, and oil and coal, of course, would be correlated with each other, would be an important factor for the demand for LNG in small-scale LNG businesses. So the PricewaterhouseCoopers conservative scenario involves a low price of oil at 50 to 60 per million BTU, and LNG price would be high at over 90. LNG price is projected to rise from its current price of 3 to 4 by the middle of this decade. And because of the pandemic, the oil price may remain low. So in this scenario, LNG demand by small-scale LNG in the world would expand by only 24%. If the current price of LNG remains at 3 to 4 from the growth rate of LNG, demand by small-scale LNG businesses would grow up by 50%. So those are the kinds of outlook of the use of LNG in small-scale LNG businesses. Now I am ready to discuss the second part of my presentation, which is the primer for application. Okay, next slide, please. Okay.
Ramon, my apologies for interrupting. I just want to make sure we're on the correct slide that you want.
Okay, I am now in the overall permitting process. I'm sorry because I'm reading from my notes presentation. So
okay,
I should have,
so
okay.
that's okay. That's okay. So this one is correct.
Okay. Let me
Has
see.
a 1, 2, and 3 step.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Very good. Very good. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry, Ramon, I believe that you're muted.
How about that? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Ramon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I'm now in the second part of my presentation, which is the primer for application. I'm starting the first slide of it, which is the overall permitting process. And this particular information is obtained from the circular of the Department of Energy on the downstream natural gas regulation. There are basically 3 permits in this particular process. The notice to proceed, the permit to construct, expand, rehabilitate, and modify, and the permit to operate and maintain. Okay, so this is the regulatory framework for the downstream natural gas industry regulation, And in the following slides, I plan to walk you through the essential information a potential investor would have to have to make a well-informed decision. Before you on this slide are 3 permits which circumscribe the entire permitting process. The NTP, number 1, the PSERM, number 2, and the permit to operate and maintain, number 3. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me elaborate on the first permit, which is the notice to proceed application process. To get a permit, the NTP permit, one has to go through 8 steps, the last being the issuance of the NTP permit itself. The events here include a pre-application conference with the DOE, where the applicant presents the general project concept to the DOE. Several documents are required, these being needed by the DOE to verify a second event in this process done by DOE, the legal, the technical, and financial analysis of the proposed LNG project. The documents required for this are listed down in Annex 4 of the Investor's Guide. Essentially, 2 important documents are highlighted. One is the sketch of the front-end engineering design of the project, and the other is the financial analysis itself of the project. Other documents needed are related to the person of the applicant itself, like the registration of the applicant with our Securities and Exchange Commission. So it is the Secretary of Energy who issues the NTP permit. And once that is issued, the NTP is valid for 6 months and extendable for another 6 months. And it tells the potential investor holding this NTP to proceed and get all the other requirements in applying for the second permit, which is the permit to construct, expand, rehabilitate, and modify, or PSERM. In evaluating the application for NTP, the DOE conducts a legal, technical, and financial evaluation of the project. As will be explained below, a holder of the NTP is supposed to secure several other permits from other government agencies. And when we developed this guide, we made it a point to find out what those other permits are. And that's our way of contributing to facilitating investments in the LNG businesses. The investor would need these permits, which I will discuss below, in applying for PSERM, the second permit. But another important task of the NTP holder is to work for the potential financing of the project, particularly for LNG terminals, which are highly capital intensive. Financial closure is important. And thirdly, the NTP holder would also now work on developing in detail its building plans and front-end engineering design of the proposed LNG facility. Next slide, please. I'm now into the PSERM application process. This is an elaboration of the process of getting the second permit. With all the requirements for a PSERM application, the applicant submits the application for PSERM for the second permit. Having validated that all requirements for PSERM are met by the applicant, the Secretary of Energy issues the PSERM to the applicant who may start the construction already of the LNG facility. The construction process has no deadline to complete. It is assumed that the investor has all the incentives not to waste time, but at the same time, not sacrificing the integrity of the proposed facility. Next slide, please. I'm now into the details about the permit to operate and maintain application process. This one here is within 30 days before the completion of the construction of the facilities, the applicant is asked to apply for the permit to operate and maintain, or POM. Once the completion is verified by DOE and supported by an interagency body, the Philippine Interagency Health, Security, and Safety Environment Inspection Monitoring Team, the DOE Secretary acts on the application. And once issued this permit, this third permit, commercial operation is allowed for an initial 25 years, renewable up to 25 years subject to certain conditions. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, this is more an elaboration of what does an NTP holder needs to do in getting the other permits. An NTP holder is given the task to secure the required permits from other regulators outside of the DOE. This slide and the next one lists down 12 agencies from which a total of 40 permits are supposed to be secured. So this information is assembled here to inform the investor what permits are supposed to be obtained from what agency, essentially to also facilitate investment decisions. For example, in this particular slide, DNR has several permits to obtain. The first one being that environmental compliance certificate. And then the other permits concerned may be obtained from specific agencies within the DNR. This is also true for the Department of Labor and Employment. Now, in some of these boxes, the steps are numbered, indicating that they are supposed to be secured in that particular order. Without these numbers, each of these permits, those indicated by the dashes, may be obtained in any order. Next slide, please. This one here is just a continuation of it. These other regulatory agencies, NWRB, the PCG, etc. So those are a lot of abbreviations for even for a Filipino, they may not be able to know the meanings of these abbreviations. So this slide tells you what those abbreviations mean. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss more about the construction phase. In the construction phase of the project, the holder of the PSERM has reportorial obligations to 5 regulatory agencies: the DOE, the Department of Labor and Employment, the DENR, Environment and Natural Resources, the Philippine Ports Authority, and the Bureau of Fire Protection. Through the construction period, several regulatory agencies, their group being called the Philippine Interagency Health, Security, and Safety Environment Inspection Monitoring Team, as well as the local government where the project is constructed, would be monitoring the construction process. And 30 days before the completion of the construction, the applicant may apply with DOE for the permit to operate and maintain, or the POM. An elaboration now of the operational stage of the project. Well, of course, before you start operating the project, assuming, for example, that you finish the construction of the facility, you need to get the business permit, the permit from the local government. This is from the LGU, where the project is located. And to secure that particular permit, there are other permits from the Department of Labor and Employment, Bureau of Fire Protection, and the LGU. So essentially what I'm trying to do here is laying down the map, the roadmap, what an investor should do in order to secure the 3 permits coming from the Department of Energy. Without this particular information, we believe that the investor would really have a very difficult time navigating through the complicated regulatory process of the Philippine government. So, continuing with the operation, this is also about, well, some of these would be reportorial obligations, or some of these have to be require submission of contingency plans, such as an oil spill contingency plan, or transactional, like getting special permits from the Philippine National Police, as natural gas is as hazardous, so transporting it in country requires these permits from the PNP. Okay. All right, I'm now into the last few slides of my presentation. So before you, this facility is covered by the PDNGR, or the circular that Assistant Secretary Pulido mentioned. You can see that these are really kind of highly capital intensive types of projects, such as the LNG terminals, and if you have some pipelines, the pipelines, or transmission distribution related facilities. Yeah, I think the PDNGR circular, I think, covers how this type of investments are going to be undertaken. However, there are other small-scale businesses like operating a domestic shipping service to transport LNG from a terminal to another storage tank, particularly those in the island provinces, or businesses that operate trucks carrying LNG, or public transport which run on compressed natural gas. And I think these kind of investments are likely to be the most numerous in number. They are not very capital intensive, so small-scale investors may want to look at this. That regulatory process needs to be developed further because it involves other regulatory agencies. For example, if you are in the LNG trucking business, this may involve the Department of Transportation, DOTR, and may have to involve the Land Transportation Regulatory Franchising Board if you have a public transport that run a vehicle that runs on natural gas, or trucking, just a service that runs on natural gas, that may have to be certified as safe by an agency like the LTO, the Land Transportation Office. Now, so there's clearly some additional work yet to be done, but don't worry. I think the first type of business that would probably happen in the Philippines would be those in the power sector. The businesses that First Gen and company are now preparing to avoid any disruption of the supply of power. In the meantime, as they are getting themselves established with their terminals, and there will be more expansion of the terminal capacity, these other non-businesses, non-power businesses would now have more time to prepare. And also for the Department of Energy and the other regulatory agencies in government to also work in order to set up further, refine further the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. Like for example, this right now in the circular, there's already this idea about accreditation and importation, for example. The Department of Energy is a regulator. This is like an automatic regulator. They have to monitor how much LNG is coming into the country. So they have to accredit the suppliers of LNG. They have to accredit importers of LNG. But the other regulatory agencies, like for example, the Bureau of Customs, the Bureau of Internal Revenue would have to come in. And I think some of these are not really unique to the LNG businesses. This marina is important because of the particular nature of the technology, and our archipelagic nature. We are likely to be using inter-island shipping for transporting LNG, and these kind of businesses are regulated by Marina. So Marina has to be able to develop its capability to ensure the safety or the integrity of these vessels to be able to carry LNG. And those are some of the additional capability building work that needs to be done over the next 1 or 2 years. And this is where I think what Ivan McLaughlin mentioned earlier about technical assistance, continuing technical assistance to the Department of Energy and the regulatory agencies in the Philippine government, or GPDP2. These are some of the works that may need to be done, like delineating agency functions for LNG project monitoring and permit applications, policy recommendations, supporting the above natural gas, continuous technical capacity development for staff and executives, technologies associated, hazards, and finding out what are needed for the permitting system, and a customized list of standards per agency. So there's work to be done still, and we're very happy to note that the Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources of the U.S. State Department has already agreed to provide additional support to the Department of Energy under GPDP 2. And I would like to shamelessly point out the accomplishment of GPDP 1. Well, starting with, it was established in launched in December 8, 2018. You can see there Secretary Alfonso Cusi and Dr. Hervasio Celda Jr. Representing the UP Statistics Center for Research Foundation Incorporated, which implemented a project which entered into a cooperative agreement with the U.S. State Department for the GPDP. So that agreement between DOE and UPSC RFI was launched in December 8, 2018. And GPDP did this kind of functions: technical assistance, capacity building, policy advisory, and research. It implemented several training programs and organized study tours to visit even LNG facilities of Pertamina in Indonesia. Thank you for Pertamina for hosting those kind of visits by our regulatory, our DOE. And GPDP's last accomplishment just before it closed in March this year is the publication of the LNG Investors Guide. Please visit the site https://www.facebook.com Gas Policy Development Project to obtain an e-copy of the guide book. And with that, thank you for listening. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ramon. That was very, very, very interesting. Mohammed, would you like to take the lead on going through? I think we have about 6 questions so far that have come into the Q&A.
I would, yeah. So first of all, I want to say good evening and good morning. I think as Assistant Secretary Polito said, depending on where you are in the world, you're either falling asleep or just barely waking up. So we thank you for taking the time to join us. I think before we get into some of the questions from the audience, I should just briefly introduce myself. I've had the pleasure of working alongside Dr. Clarete and at the request of the DOE and Assistant Secretary Polito as part of our State Department support, for energy sector development in the Philippines. And I specifically am part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, working on issues of commercial finance and sort of marketability and investment concerns. And here's my question. I think I'm going to pose this to both Dr. Clarete and Assistant Secretary Polito, if you don't mind. But I've had the honor of working in probably 20 or 30 countries over the last decade on energy sector development. And what really strikes me as being so unique about the process that you followed for developing this LNG opportunity in the Philippines is that from day one, it seemed like you're reaching out to all of the relevant stakeholders. And I mean true outreach. I mean, and this is the question, if you can perhaps remind the audience of just how many voices have been a part of this process. I believe across the government, everything from the maritime regulator to the fire safety side, you've worked with local government officials. If you could just briefly summarize how you've gotten to this point, because I don't think it was an internal conversation. I don't think you could have gotten this far if you hadn't done such a good job of building consensus and done that outreach. So let me just pose that question first, if you could educate our audience on the decision you made to have outreach and inclusion in this regulatory development process.
Who would answer that first? Assistant Secretary?
I think let's start with the Assistant Secretary, but Dr. Clarete, I think you as well, because I think the university hosted that dialogue as well.
Okay. I have 2 factors in my mind for that as an answer. I think number one, I think is the Department of Energy, I think has high respect among the other regulatory agencies. Energy is just a very important matter for the country. And when the DOE calls for this kind of meetings, they give some premium to that. The second, I think, is the LNG itself. This is something new for them. What is this LNG? This is they have heard this, but then they really want to know more about it. So when GPDP and DOE calls for some training and meetings, like for example, when we assembled that information about the permits required, they gladly shared all this kind of information to us. So because they just want to be cooperative and know more about LNG and know more about what needs to be done in order to be able to regulate well when it comes to LNG. Thank you.
I guess for us at the Department of Energy, it started with a simple worry. A simple worry and the simple acknowledgement that as many books and as many YouTube videos that you watch, nothing beats talking to as many people who have as much more experience regarding the topic, regarding the industry than you do. And it's that acknowledgement that drove us, and that worry that there might be something that we're overlooking. And so the more experts from different fields, the more partners we can have I think it would be better. It's best to start this way, especially for such a nascent industry, something that's so unfamiliar to the country. LNG is just really new for us, and it's that acknowledgement and that worry that drove people from the Department of Energy and our partners in the academe, like Dr. Ramon Clarete, and why we kept bothering our friends from across the borders. So.
It was hardly a bother. I mean, again, I have to say, it's been such a pleasure working, alongside you on this. I think one of the questions to the audience sort of builds on this as well. And this is a question for both of you, but perhaps Assistant Secretary, if we could start with you this time, just because I think there's a question of just how ambitious the effort is at the DOE for building out the LNG sector, the LNG marketplace. You've hinted at this, you've mentioned it, but your vision, as I understand it, and this is the question, includes not just the near-term goal of replacing the gas supply that was formerly sourced domestically, but bringing in new uses, other actual technological uses, whether it's for a marine fuel or for offsite generation, and new users, right? More marketing agents, more competition. I mean, can you just remind us of how broad the plan is at this point?
A lot of the things that you mentioned, we're trying to contain them in an initial law, which is the natural gas law. And as you said, it's kind of ambitious. We really want to expand the use of natural gas. For a variety of reasons. Primarily, we feel that by increasing the use of natural gas, we would be, helping the environment. We would be taking advantage of leveraging economies of scale, making liquefied natural gas hopefully cheaper in the country. It's also a security issue at the same time. So we wanted more fuel choices for our industries in the Philippines. And we believe it's a great opportunity. It really was a challenge and a problem at first. The problem was, how do you ensure supply for those critical power plants, providing, as we explained earlier, providing a huge chunk of the power generation in Luzon, which is the main island of the Philippines. So it was a problem at first, but now we see it as an opportunity, and it's a really good opportunity to take part of and push for.
Dr. Clarete, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think it's the problem becoming an opportunity. I think that's an important takeaway from this particular webinar. That we're not just really talking here about this replacement. We're also talking about two other things. We are going to increase our energy power, our power requirement, because we are planning. I mean, let's set aside the pandemic first, no, and the contraction of the economies. But we did have a very great plan of sustaining at least 7% growth over the next until 2040, in order to be able to get rid of poverty, income poverty, by 2040 in this country. And that requires this estimated 26 gigawatts 44, I'm sorry, that needs to be supplied. And it could be supplied, of course, by other fuels like coal. But I really think that the LNG may have a very good chance at capturing some of that market. The other part is, of course, opening this LNG gives ideas of other smaller scale projects using LNG. And they have now a chance. They did not have that chance before because all of Malampaya was used up by the 5 gas plants in Batangas.
And Mohammed, is actually a
please.
question regarding small scale use of LNG.
Yeah, please.
And I agree with Dr. Clarete, with Dr. Ramon. Yeah, it was a problem, but now it's an opportunity, and it's a really good takeaway. The difficulty really before in trying to push for the adoption of small-scale use of LNG across the archipelago of the Philippines is the adequacy of supply. So if you have a problem where you need to ensure supply, and then suddenly occurs to you, you might as well take that opportunity to improve upon the current structure, the current policy framework, the current regulatory framework. In one of the questions that was mentioned earlier, the person asking the question mentioned the current problem or the current challenge in promoting the use of other fuels in our off-grid areas because of the presence of subsidies for diesel fuels, and that's a regime that we inherited from a previous administration, and that regime, since it works, there has been no other further motivation to try to change it. It works. It's well, the program is actually called by the provision in the law, which is a missionary electrification, and that's, since it works, no one's tried to change it in the last 10, 15 years. And but now, considering the existence of that technology, of being able to use small-scale LNG in off-grid areas, and now we have an opportunity to try to change that regime. The DOE actually has an effort with our Power Bureau to try to amend the law regarding pass-through for fuel costs to consumers in off-grid areas all over the country, to study that further. And one of the things that the Secretary of Energy wants to study very well is how to start removing those subsidies. It's actually pretty controversial. I'm pretty sure we're going to get a bit of blowback regarding that, but we have to start trying to improve the system, and we have this opportunity. If you have a technology that would allow us to start changing parts of that regulatory framework, parts of that policy framework, then I think we should take that opportunity.
Well, I think you raise a very important point, that it's not just continuing the legacy of the status quo, but it's an opportunity to inject a little bit more innovation, a little bit more opportunity in the marketplace. If I could ask a related question, there's a question here from the audience about, what is the expected impact on electricity prices from LNG? I mean, right now you have gas-fired power, which is based upon a lower cost domestic source, and LNG would be higher cost. But I guess let me rephrase the question this way. I think Assistant Secretary and Ramon, you had said this, sorry, Dr. Puerta, you said this as well. The idea is that stabilizing and possibly even increasing the flexibility of the natural gas supply should unlock other sources in the marketplace, right? The idea that it could complement increased use of solar or offshore wind, whatever it may be. Is that an explicit part of, I think, the DOE's vision here, is that this becomes sort of a complement in the electricity mix, not simply a replacement of the existing natural gas, baseload that you have now? What impact do you think it will have on the actual electricity market specifically?
Sorry. So I'm not. I'll start with a disclaimer, and that I don't have the technical background to go into the details and stuff. But the people who do know, who do have that background, our engineers, our scientists, our researchers, our policymakers, and our Power Bureau, they claim, based on several studies that they made, that we need more flexible generation in the Philippines. That's the claim. I'm sure there will be some experts who may discount that, who may not agree with that, but that's something that we're seriously considering. And because of that need, we feel that by allowing or by having that infrastructure in the Philippines, it would address that issue. And by addressing that issue of having more flexible generation, you also solve the issue of using renewable energy. You need flexible generation in order to complement the further use of renewable energy. And so with that hand in hand, there's actually a question here regarding whether or not the Department of Energy is by a former official of the Department of Energy, whether or not the Department of Energy is preparing soon for the prohibition of future coal plants. Mr. Cyril Del Callar, who's a former official of the national government, it's not really prohibiting the use of future coal plants. Instead, we want to promote the use of flexible generation. Of course, the effect would be lessening the use of coal plants, because coal plants are inflexible. It's baseload generation. So are we preparing? Yes, we're preparing, and we're promoting the use of flexible generation.
Just to add to Assistant Secretary Pulido's answer, yeah, I've been doing this kind of study right now, this whole idea of smart pricing using switching curves. As you can see, of course, REs, for example, have zero variable cost basically, but they do have some intermittency problems, and they're clean energy. And then at the same time, you have this disadvantage of LNG because of the transportation problem of the gas, which raises its cost relative to coal. So in other words, this variable cost is kind of a disadvantage to them. So somehow a combination, this technology has to be worked out still. And the beauty of the LNG gas turbines is that they are so flexible. They can be just mobilized when clouds are already, making solar plants difficult to supply electricity. So as you can see, the combination of the two potentially can offset the variable cost disadvantage of LNG, and also offset the disadvantage of REs like solar or their intermittency problem. And both, I mean, fossil fuel, LNG of course is not as clean as REs, but relatively cleaner compared to coal. And so you can probably have a benefit also for the environmental gain, but at the same time provide cost competitive electricity at 24/7 basis.
And I'll add just, from a comparative perspective, I think your analysis at the DUA level and your economic analysis, Dr. Fuerte, is not unique. There's a growing body of research and policy that argues that a combination of renewable energy and flexible natural gas is probably the most likely candidate for replacing coal. In South Africa, they've run the numbers and they have very cheap coal. The only way to beat the coal baseload price is to have a high penetration of solar combined with natural gas. Here in the US, we've seen a direct correlation between a drop in coal utilization and a rise in natural gas utilization supplemented by renewables. So I think, again, it's helpful to know that you are, in a way, on top of or even ahead of that trend, recognizing the long-term potential. Let me just ask this very quickly. Even I think one of the audience members pointed out that Malampaya perhaps isn't as cheap as it may seem as well, that LNG on a gas for gas molecule basis may be competitive, but that leads to another question here. I know we have time for only a few more, and let me remind the audience, please post your questions because we do have a little bit more time. Maybe this will be the last question, and we'll see if we have time afterwards. Let me ask it this way. Your effort at the DOE, Assistant Secretary, and Dr. Colette, I think you understood this because you've seen the vision from the very beginning, is not for a new government stimulus or a new government intervention of the marketplace, as I understand it. I think you're trying to create an opportunity. You're trying to create a space for investors to come in and guide the market, whether they want to build a facility for their own utilization like first gen, or whether they want to build an import facility to serve other customers in the market. I mean, I think if you could just clarify for our audience here, and I think this is in the investment guide as well, it is a definition of an opening to the marketplace, but not a definition of what investors have to do. I mean, you're not really constraining any uses, any scale, anything of that sort, right? I mean, if you could just describe that, because I think that's also unique in the region as well, just how open-ended you've made this and how much deference you've given to the vision that investors want to bring to the table.
Precisely, Mohammed. You hit it exactly on the head. That was really the main objective when we were trying to craft these policies with the help of all of the academia and of course our colleagues from across the pond, as they say. We were very, very careful that the national government doesn't put too much regulatory capture. It's for a nascent industry as this, it's a delicate balance between making sure it's safe, making sure that we avoid anti-competitive behavior, that we avoid monopolies or any restraints in trade. But at the same time, we felt that from what we've learned from readings and discussions with our neighbors and from across the sea, having a more open market being more of a partner than just a regulator would be helpful in establishing a nascent industry.
Yeah, I think again to add to Assistant Secretary Pulido, I think the industry here in the Philippines, especially the natural gas or the LNG, is really built around a private sector industry. I mean, the DOE could probably have built its own facility, but it chose not to. It believed that the private sector has the capital and the know-how to actually basically set up the industries. And all that they need to do is to regulate it well. And just as what Assistant Secretary Pulido mentioned, provide an environment for private sector investors to basically come to an informed decision about what to do, what kind of projects they have to invest. And more importantly, I think even the safety related regulations, HSEC related regulations, yeah, we recognize that there's just a lot of permits that we have to go through, but it will take some time before the entire government of the Philippines should realize that we have such a complicated regulatory structure. But in the meantime, the minimum that we can do to facilitate investments is to let potential investors know this is the roadmap for it. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you both, both Assistant Secretary Pulido and Dr. Colerte. Again, I'm a bit of a biased party here because I really enjoyed the work that we've all done together, but also as somebody who's had the pleasure of seeing many markets, I do think the guide represents exactly the point you just made, which is this is a uniquely private sector focus and private sector empowering process. So congratulations on that. I'm going to tell the audience, thank you very much for your questions. Apologies for not having time for all of them. I believe we're going to try and gather these and ask our participants if they wouldn't mind answering them offline and perhaps sharing those answers. But with that, I will pass the floor to Paul. I believe we're preparing to close the program. Again, thank you everybody for your questions and to our panelists for answering.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Song. I'm the Deputy of the Environment Office at USAID Philippines. And I would just like to really thank our moderators and each of today's speakers, especially Assistant Secretary Pulido, Dr. Clarete, for participating in this webinar. We appreciate your time and collaborative spirit. The investor guide highlighted today was developed to assist potential investors interested in the Philippine market to identify and secure necessary permits and clearances from government agencies and to be aware of technical standards for compliance. So we really encourage everyone to consider replicating and tailoring these guides to your own specific markets to help achieve national goals and achieve gas sector investment. The guide provides an overview of the LNG industry in the country, the current regulatory framework, incentives and policies, and discussion on potential investment areas. It articulates required legal, technical, financial documentation, and lays out requirements in the pre-construction phase and operation of the facilities, including permit and clearance requirements from other government agencies. This type of guide serves as a reference for industry stakeholders on the application requirements and processes involved in constructing and operating an LNG facility. This guide is a product of the United States' Asia Edge initiative, which is really helping develop sustainable and secure energy markets throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Through Asia Edge, USAID is supporting our partners to expand energy access, promote energy diversification and trade, and strengthen energy security. So we encourage you to seize opportunities to increase investment to meet growing energy demands. Data shows that these efforts pursued by governments to streamline permitting and application processes and eliminating unnecessary activities that impede economic progress will result in increased investment to empower future generations to come. So it is instrumental to provide the necessary information to all of the key players involved in developing the LNG industry. Achieving successful development of gas infrastructure and LNG plants is a complex process that requires communication, transparency, and ongoing dialogue among national governments, local governments, and private sector and other stakeholders. The U.S.-Asia Gas Partnership will continue to work to open lines of communication, promote partnership and mutual trust between government officials and industry. As part of AGP, Naruk recently hosted a webinar and drafted a roadmap for the development of downstream natural gas markets. It's a step-by-step guide for energy regulators. It's an important tool to establish natural gas markets in the Asia-Pacific region. It maps out essential regulatory steps, provisions, and necessary considerations to establish diversified and competitive downstream gas sectors in countries integrating imported LNG resources. The final report to be released will incorporate feedback from this webinar. Beginning in June, AGP began hosting a series of webinars with presentations given by internationally renowned gas sector experts on a variety of topics. If you haven't done so already, please register for these upcoming webinars to listen or listen to pre-recorded webinars in the series at usea.org. Upcoming webinar topics will include sessions on creating favorable investment climates and economic conditions for natural gas in the Indo-Pacific on September 15th, followed by a presentation by the American Petroleum Institute on standards. So in closing, I would like to thank you all once again for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you virtually probably in the upcoming Asia Gas Partnership webinar sessions. Thank you very much.